I've spent 41 years of my life listening to clocks. So when I tell you that man had his hand around that little girl's throat for 4 seconds, I don't mean about 4 seconds. I don't mean it felt like 4 seconds. I mean four. I counted them the way I count everything without deciding to, the way you'd blink. 1, 2, 3, 4. And on the fourth one, something happened at the east gate of Ellinghall Palace that I have not been able to stop thinking about since. Let me back up. I'll do this properly. My wife always said I tell stories like I'm winding a watch, slow at the start, and then all at once. My name's Dennis Whitlow. Most people call me Den. I'm 61, I've got a bad left knee and a worse temper before 10 in the morning, and I repair clocks. Mantle clocks, long case carriage clocks, the occasional pocket watch if the owner's patient and the movement isn't ruined. My shop is 2 streets back from the river, down where the buildings still have soot on them from a century of coal. That Thursday in late September, I had a clock to deliver. It was a French mantle clock, gilt bronze, from one of the drawing rooms at Ellinghall. Not a famous piece. It hadn't chimed properly since before I was born, and somebody in the household finally got round to sending it out. I'd had it on my bench for 11 weeks. I'd replaced the suspension spring, cleaned the pivots, rebushed 2 of them, and adjusted the strike train until it rang exactly on the hour and not 2 seconds after. 2 seconds. That's the sort of thing that keeps me awake. That's the sort of man I am. I had it in a wooden box packed with wool blankets, and I'd carried it on the bus like a man carrying a baby, and the whole journey I could hear it ticking through the wood. Because of course I'd wound it. Just a little. Just to hear it. You have to understand that about me before I tell you the rest. I hear time, constantly. It is not a lovely thing. It's more like tinnitus. Ellinghall Palace sits at the top of a long gray avenue with plane trees down both sides. And in late September, those trees drop their leaves in these big flat hands that stick to the pavement when it rains. It had rained that morning. Then it had stopped, the way it does in this country, not clearing, just pausing like the sky's thinking about it. The air was warm and wet, and the stone of the palace had gone dark at the base where the water had soaked up into it. Everything smelled of leaves and diesel, and faintly of the coffee cart that parks by the corner. There were maybe 200 people along the railings. I want to describe them, because everybody always describes the palace and nobody ever describes the people. And it was the people that made the whole thing what it was. There was a school group, maybe 30 kids, 11 or 12 years old, in green blazers, and 2 teachers who had clearly lost the will to live somewhere around the second bus. There was a hen party, 6 women, sashes, one of them holding a pair of shoes in her hand and walking in socks, which at 11 in the morning tells you a story all by itself. There were the usual couples with phones held up over their heads. A man selling little plastic guardsmen out of a suitcase and doing badly at it. And there was a woman with a pram, standing very close to the railing, rocking it with her hip and not looking at anything, just rocking, the way you do when you haven't slept in 4 months. I remember all of them. That's the strange thing about a day like that. You remember the wallpaper. The East Gate isn't the main gate. The main gate has the big ceremonial business, the changing, the band, the crowd 4 deep. The East Gate is where the vans come in, where the staff come in, where a clock repairer with a wooden box comes in. And there's one guard on the box there, just one. His name, I learned it later when everybody learned it, was Guardsman Thomas Ashby, 23 years old, 2 years in. At the time, he was just a man in a red tunic and a bearskin, standing in a stone recess about 3 feet up off the pavement, absolutely still, rifle at his side, chin level, eyes on nothing. I got there at 11:04. I know because I checked my watch, which I don't need to do, and did anyway. They weren't ready for me. The clock had to be signed for by a man who was, apparently, in a meeting. Somebody at the gatehouse told me to wait, and I said I'd wait by the railings, and they said fine, and that was that. So I stood, with a ticking box in my arms, 10 feet from Guardsman Ashby. And I did what I always do when I have nothing else to do. I watched. Here's what I noticed in 20 minutes of standing there, and I'll give it to you in the order I noticed it. His boots were wet, not soaked, just dark across the toes from the earlier rain, which meant he'd come on post before it stopped, which meant he'd been out there over an hour already. There was a wasp, late-season wasp, drunk and stupid, and it kept coming back to his collar, and he did not move. Not once. I watched that wasp land on the strap under his chin and sit there for perhaps 8 seconds and walk about on him like he was a fence post, and his face did nothing at all. A man in a rugby shirt stood next to him and pulled a face and had his photo taken. The guard did nothing. A little boy, 4 maybe, stood and stared straight up at him with his mouth open for the better part of a minute, and the guard did nothing, and the boy's mother had to physically pick him up and carry him away, and he screamed the whole time about the Red Soldier. One of the hen party women came up, waved a hand in front of his eyes, said something I couldn't hear and got not a flicker. Her friends howled. She curtsied at him badly and went back to them. And through all of it, the box in my arms went tick, 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 and I found myself doing a thing I have done since I was 19 years old. I timed his breathing. You can see it if you know how to look. Not the chest, the tunic's too stiff. The nostrils, the tiny movement at the base of the throat. 4 seconds in, 6 out, more or less. Slow, even. About 9 breaths a minute, which is a slower breath than most men manage sitting down. That's a trained thing. You don't breathe like that by accident. Somebody taught him that, or he taught himself, standing on that box in the rain, hour after hour, learning how to make a body go quiet. I thought, that lad has turned himself into a clock. And I liked him for it. I liked him without knowing a single thing about him. At about 20 past 11, the man in the gray anorak arrived. I want to be careful here, because it's easy, afterwards, to say I knew straight away. Everybody says that. Everybody remembers being cleverer than they were. I didn't know, not straight away. What I noticed first was that he was standing wrong. Everybody at those railings stands the same way, and you don't realize it until somebody doesn't. They face the guard, or they face the palace, or their phone, or their friend. Their body points at the thing they've come to see. He was facing the gate. Not the guard, the gate itself. The black iron, the gap where the drive runs up through the arch. He stood square onto it with his hands down at his sides and his head slightly forward, like a man reading small print on a wall. He was maybe 40. Gray anorak zipped to the throat, though it was warm, thin dark trousers. And here's the detail that snagged on me and wouldn't come loose. He was wearing shoes with no socks. Proper shoes, leather laced, and bare white ankles above them wet from the pavement. Now I'm not a policeman, I'm a man who fixes clocks, but when you spend your life inside mechanisms, you develop a feeling for when something is out of beat. A clock out of beat has an uneven tick, tick-tock, tick-tock. The layman doesn't hear it, I hear it from the next room. That man was out of beat. He wasn't carrying anything. No bag, no phone, no camera, no coffee. In a crowd of 200 people, every single one of whom was holding something, he was holding nothing at all. And his lips were moving. I looked away. I want to be honest with you, because there's no point telling this story if I'm going to come out of it well. I looked away. I thought, poor devil, I thought, not my business. I thought about the clock in my arms and whether the man in the meeting was ever coming out, and I shifted my weight because my knee was starting up, and I looked at the school group instead, and about 4 minutes went by. 4 minutes. I could have said something to somebody in 4 minutes. I've done that arithmetic more times than I can tell you. Then the mood at the railings changed, all at once, the way a room changes when somebody famous walks in. A sound went through the crowd, not a cheer, a sort of lift, 200 people all inhaling. Because the family were coming down the drive, on foot. You want to know how rare that is? I'd lived in that city all my life and I'd never once seen it. Cars, yes. Glass tinted, gone in 3 seconds. But there they were, walking on the gravel like anybody, coming down from the direction of the garden entrance where, I later found out, they'd just come back from something at a primary school half a mile away. The Duchess of Rossmere, camel coat, flat shoes, hair up. Two protection officers, one either side and half a step back, in dark suits with their hands loose. A woman with a folder walking fast. And the little one. Princess Eleonora, Nell they call her. She was 8. I'd only ever seen her in photographs, and photographs lie about children. In photographs she was a small polished thing in a coat. In life she was a whirlwind with a gap in her teeth. She was in a navy dress and green Wellingtons at a palace, because it had rained and somebody sensible had put her in them, and she was skipping, not walking, skipping in that stuttering way children do, 3 steps and a hop, 3 steps and a hop, and she had made herself a crown out of yellow paper, and it was slipping off the back of her head, and she kept pushing it back on with one hand. The crowd made a noise. Phones went up like a shoal of fish turning. And Nell, because she was 8, and because nobody had told her she couldn't, swerved. She left the drive and cut across the wet gravel towards the railings. I heard the Duchess say her name, not sharp, weary, the way you say a child's name when they've done a thing they always do. There's a bit of open ground inside the east gate where the drive widens. 10 feet, maybe 12, of gravel between the railings and the gate itself, and the gate was standing open because a delivery van had gone in 5 minutes earlier and hadn't come out. That is the whole thing. That is the entire tragedy of the day in one sentence. The gate was open because a van hadn't come out. She ran to the railings and grabbed 2 of the bars and put her face between them and shouted hello at the crowd, and 200 people laughed and shouted hello back, and one of the hen party burst into tears, which I thought was excessive, but there we are. A protection officer moved after her, unhurried, 3 or 4 paces behind. The other one stayed with the Duchess. Standard, I imagine. There were railings. There was a wall. There was a guard on a box. This was the safest 10 feet of pavement in the country. Nell went along the railings, sideways, dragging her hand across the bars, so they went ting, 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 ting like a stick along a fence, laughing at her own noise, and she came right up level with the gate. Right up level with the open gate. And she stopped, because she'd seen the guard. I was maybe 15 feet from her, close enough that I could see the paper crown had NELL written on it in wobbly letters, and a lot of glitter that had already come off on her hands. She stared up at Guardsman Ashby the way that 4-year-old boy had, absolutely rapt, head all the way back. And then she said, quite loudly, in the voice of a child who has just had an outstanding idea, "Are you real?" The crowd went off like a firework. People roared. The Duchess put her hand over her eyes. The woman with the folder was already walking faster. And Ashby did not move. Not his eyes, not his mouth. The wasp had come back by then and was crawling across the peak of his brow, and he stood there in his 100-year-old uniform with a wasp on his face and a princess at his feet asking if he was real. And he was so still that he might have been cast in the same bronze as the clock in my arms. I remember thinking, with something like pride, on behalf of a man I'd never met, "Good lad, don't you dare." I don't know exactly when I saw the anorak move. I've tried. I've gone over it. And the honest answer is that my eyes were on the girl and on the guard, and the gray came in from the left side of my vision like something entering a room in a dream. And by the time I turned my head, it was already too late to be a warning. He wasn't running. That's what nobody believes when I tell them. He was walking. He walked the way you'd walk to a bus you knew would wait, straight through the gap where 2 people had stepped aside to let a pushchair by, past the man selling plastic Guardsmen, onto the gravel through the open gate. Nobody stopped him because nobody could think of a reason to. There was no shout, no scream, no drawn anything. A man in a gray coat walked 11 feet across a gravel drive with his lips moving. The protection officer's head came round. I saw that. I saw the exact moment. He was 3 paces behind Nell, half turned to the crowd, and his head came round and his hand went inside his jacket and his mouth opened. And by then, the man in gray had reached the girl. Here's where I stop being a witness and start being a man with a very specific curse. Because my brain, God help me, started counting. He reached down, not fast, almost gentle, which is the part I have never been able to say out loud without stopping halfway. He reached down and he took the child by the throat with his right hand and he lifted her, not off her feet, she was too heavy for that, but up onto her toes, and her yellow paper crown came off the back of her head and went down onto the wet gravel and turned dark where it hit the puddle. That second one. The Duchess screamed. It didn't sound like a woman screaming. It sounded like something tearing. 200 phones came down at once. The hen party woman with the shoes dropped them, and the sound of them hitting the pavement was, I swear, the loudest thing in the world for a moment. A teacher grabbed a boy by the blazer and yanked him backwards into the group. Somebody near me said no in a small conversational voice, like they'd been told the shop was out of milk. That second, too. Nell's hands came up. Both of them. Small hands, still glittery, and she got them onto the man's wrist and she pulled, the way a child pulls, with everything she has and no idea how to use it, and her Wellingtons scraped on the gravel and one of them came half off her heel. That second, 3. And the protection officer was moving now, running. But he was 3 paces back, and 3 paces is a long way. It is a very long way, and his hand was still coming out of his jacket, and the second officer was 15 feet behind him and hadn't even begun to turn, and the woman with the folder had frozen solid with the folder still under her arm. 3 paces. In 3 paces a man can do anything he likes to a child. That second, 4. And on the 4th second, I heard a sound I have never heard before or since. The sound of 130 pounds of scarlet and steel and boot leather coming off a stone plinth. Guardsman Thomas Ashby had been standing so still for so long that the crowd had stopped believing he was a person. The tourists had stopped seeing a man. They'd been photographing furniture. And the furniture came down off the box. He didn't shout first. That's the thing. There was no cry, no order, no stop that came a half beat later, once he was already in motion, and when it came it wasn't a shout so much as a bark, one flat syllable from somewhere down in the chest, so loud that people 20 feet behind me told the papers they felt it more than heard it. He hit the gravel. I heard the crunch. I heard the rifle sling slap against the tunic. I saw the bearskin come forward as he drove off his back foot, and something about that, the hat, the ridiculous, beautiful 200-year-old hat, streaming forward like a black flame. 9 feet. He had 9 feet to cover. And I was standing there, 61 years old, with a bad knee and a French mantle clock in my arms, and I could not move, and I could not shout, and my useless brain was going. 5. 6. 7. I never got to 8. There's a sound a body makes when it's hit properly, and it isn't the sound they use in films. In films it's a sort of slap. In life it's lower than that. It's a thud you feel in the soles of your feet through wet gravel from 15 feet away. Ashby didn't punch him. I want that understood, because half the country got it wrong afterwards and the other half wanted it to be wrong. He didn't swing at him. He didn't club him with the rifle. He put his left shoulder into the man's ribs below the arm, and he kept his legs driving, and he took that man off his feet the way water takes a sandcastle. 9 feet in what the police later timed, off the phone footage, at 1.5 seconds. Boots on gravel, 3 strides, and then everything in the world moved sideways at once. Gray coat, black bearskin, both of them airborne in a way for the fraction of a second before the ground came up. And Nell dropped. That's the bit that goes through me. The hand came off her throat and there was nothing holding her up anymore, and her legs had gone soft, and she just went down onto her hands and knees on the gravel with her hair over her face. One green Wellington off. One sock, white, wet. She didn't cry, not then. She knelt there and she made a sound like she was trying to swallow something too big over and over, and that was worse than crying. That was so much worse than crying. The two of them hit the ground and slid. I'll tell you exactly what I saw because I've told it to a police officer, and to a lawyer, and to my brother-in-law who didn't believe me, and to my wife, God rest her, who did. The rifle went out, deliberately. Ashby's right arm shot out sideways at full stretch and pinned that weapon flat to the gravel, muzzle away, as far from the man's body and the girl's body as it was possible to put it, and he held it there. In the middle of all that, with a man under him, he had one arm doing nothing else but keeping that rifle out of the equation. That is not instinct. Nobody is born doing that. Somebody drilled it into him on a wet parade square when he was 19 years old and bored and thinking about his dinner, and it lived in him, and it came out when the roof fell in. His left forearm went across the man's collarbone. His knee came up and turned in, and that was it. That was the whole fight. It lasted less time than it takes to read this sentence. Then the first protection officer arrived, and I mean arrived, the way a train arrives, and the second one, and a man in a black tie I hadn't even seen before. And there were suddenly 4 bodies in a heap on the gravel, and someone was shouting numbers, actual numbers, into a sleeve. The bearskin had come off. It rolled about 4 feet and stopped against the base of the gate pillar, and it sat there looking ridiculous and enormous, and somehow ashamed of itself. And underneath it, kneeling on a man's chest, was a boy. That's what the crowd saw. That's what made 200 people go quiet at exactly the same moment, and I've never heard anything like it before or since. The sound of a crowd realizing something altogether. Because the guard without the hat was 23. Ginger, close-cropped, cheeks red from the cold and the effort, a shaving nick under his jaw. He had a face like every lad who ever stacked shelves at my local co-op. Nobody had ever thought about that. Not one of us. We'd photographed him for an hour and never once wondered how old he was. The Duchess got to her daughter before anybody else did. I saw a woman in a camel coat go over that gravel in flat shoes at a dead sprint, and she went down onto her knees so hard I heard it, and she got that child up against her, and she put her hand on the back of Nell's head and pressed her face into her shoulder. She wasn't screaming anymore. She was saying, "I've got you, I've got you, I've got you," very fast and very quietly into her hair, and she was rocking, and she did not look at the man on the ground once. Not once. Her whole world had gone down to about 18 inches wide. And the crowd was awful. I say that as one of them. Phones, all of them back up in the air, higher than before. A man beside me was filming and narrating, saying, oh my days," in a delighted sort of voice. 2 of the schoolchildren were crying, and their teacher was trying to turn 30 of them around at once like she was herding water. The woman with the pram had backed off 10 feet and had both arms wrapped over the hood of it, curled around it, as if the sky might fall. And me. I was standing in exactly the same place I'd been standing 4 minutes earlier, when I'd looked at a man with no socks on and thought not my business. I still had the clock in my arms. I hadn't moved a step. Now I have to tell you about the thing that changed the story for me, and it isn't the tackle. They were pulling him up, 2 officers had him, and he wasn't fighting. He hadn't fought at all, not for a second. He'd gone down like a coat off a peg, and he lay there with his hands open and his mouth going, and when they turned him over onto his front, his cheek was in the gravel and he was still talking. I was close, 15 feet, and everybody else was making a great deal of noise, and somehow I heard it. He said, "Tell her, you have to tell her." He said it maybe 5 times, to nobody, to the ground. His anorak had ridden up and I could see his back, and he was thin. Not slim. Thin. And on the palm of his right hand, the hand that had been round that little girl's throat, the hand that was now flat on the wet stone with a police officer's thumb across the wrist, there was a child's name written in blue biro. Not Eleonora, not Nell, a different name. I'm not going to say it here. It's not mine to say, and there are people alive who'd rather it wasn't in anybody's mouth. But it was written on his hand, in his own writing, small and careful, and it had run in the rain. I found out the rest the way everybody did, in pieces, over the following week, from newspapers that got most of it wrong and one that got it right. He was 42. He had been unwell for a long time and had been well again for a while. And then, in June, the arrangement that kept him well had come apart, the way those arrangements do when there aren't enough people to hold them together. He had not slept properly for 11 days. He had walked into the city from somewhere 20 miles out. 8 years earlier, he had lost a daughter. She would have been about 8. He was never charged with what the front pages said he'd be charged with. There was no organization. There was no cause. There was no manifesto. There was a man who had stopped being able to tell what year it was, walking towards a small girl in a paper crown, in a gray coat and no socks, with a name written on his hand so he wouldn't forget it. Do what you like with that. I've had years and I still don't know where to put it. Here's the part I'd want you to remember, if you remember anything. They had him. 2 officers face down, arms out. It was over. And there was a moment, I saw it, when one of them, a big lad, had his knee coming up and a look on his face that I understood completely, and would have forgiven completely, because that man had just put his hands on a child in front of her mother. And Ashby, still on the ground, said something. I couldn't hear the words at first. His head was down near the man's, 6 inches away, and he was breathing like a bellows, and his hair was stuck flat to his forehead. I've asked. I've never had it confirmed. But the woman who was standing right at the railing, the one from the hen party, the one who'd waved her hand in front of his eyes and got nothing, she was 3 feet from his back, and she told the police the same thing I'd have told them. He said, all right now, you're all right. Not to the officers. To him. Then he got up. He got up off that man, and he stepped back, and he stood there for a second with his chest going, and his empty hands out slightly from his sides, and he looked at the little girl in her mother's arms. That's the only time. That's the only time in the whole thing that Thomas Ashby looked at Princess Eleonora. 1 second, maybe less, long enough to see that she was upright and breathing and being held. And then he turned around and he picked up his bearskin. He knocked it against his leg once to get the water off. He put it on. He straightened it with both hands, the way you'd straighten a tie in a shop window. He picked up his rifle and he checked it. I saw his eyes go down it, and he walked back across 9 feet of gravel that now had a Wellington boot and a paper crown lying on it. He stepped up onto the box. He put his heels together. And he stood. I'm 61 years old, and I have never seen anything like it in my life, and I do not expect to again. There was a woman crying about 10 feet away. There were sirens coming from 3 directions. There was a princess being carried up a gravel drive in a camel coat with 1 boot on, and a man being cuffed on the ground, and 200 people all shouting at once, and one of the schoolboys had been sick. And in the middle of it, in that stone recess, a 23-year-old man with a shaving nick under his jaw stood at ease with his chin level and his eyes on nothing, and made his face do absolutely nothing at all. He was shaking. You could see it in the rifle, just a fine tremor in the muzzle, about as much as you'd see in an old man's hand. But he stood there. He was on that post for another 50 minutes, because that was when the relief was due, and nobody had told him to leave it, so he didn't leave it. 50 minutes, in front of the phones, in front of the police tape. In front of every person on that pavement who now knew exactly how old he was, and exactly what his face looked like, and exactly what he sounded like when he shouted, and who all of us, every single one, kept looking at him and looking away again, ashamed, the way you look at somebody who has done a thing you know you couldn't have done. I watched his breathing, because that's what I am, and it's the only prayer I know. It took him 9 minutes to get it back down. 9 minutes, and then it was 4 seconds in, 6 out, slow and even, 9 breaths to the minute, like a well-adjusted movement in a case of scarlet cloth. The wasp came back. Of course it did. It landed on his collar. He didn't move. They cleared us out about 12:30. I gave my name to a young officer with a wet notebook, and I told her about the socks and about the 4 minutes, and she wrote down the first thing and not the second, and she said, "You couldn't have known, sir," in a kind, practiced voice, and moved on to the next person. I still had the clock. I sat down on the curb by the coffee cart, which had shut, and I put the box on my knees and I opened it. People want me to tell them the clock had stopped. They want that. I've had it suggested to me at 3 separate dinner parties, and I suppose it had stopped, hadn't it, at the exact moment, and there's a light that goes on in their faces, and I have to put it out. It hadn't stopped. It was ticking. It was ticking exactly as it had been ticking on the bus that morning, gilt bronze and glass. 11 weeks of my life. The strike train perfect. The beat dead even, going tick and tick and tick on my knees while a man was driven away in the back of a van, and a little girl was somewhere inside that building being looked at by a doctor. That's the thing nobody tells you about the worst 4 seconds of your life. Nothing stops, the clocks don't stop, the wasps carry on, the rain comes back at 2. I'll finish it off quickly, because there isn't much more and most of it you can find yourself. The Duchess wrote to him, privately. It never leaked and I hope it never does. The ministry put out 3 sentences and a photograph of a cap badge. And the internet did what it does. Half of them made him a saint, and the other half went hunting through his life for something to bring him down with, and found a fight outside a pub in Doncaster when he was 19, and made a great deal of it for 2 days. He gave the press exactly 1 line, months later, when they finally cornered him at some ceremony he clearly hated. Somebody asked him what went through his mind. He said, "She was in front of me." That's all he ever said. 4 words, and he wouldn't be drawn on it, and I've come to think it's the most complete answer anybody's ever given to that question. She was in front of him, 9 feet. That's all it was to him, a distance to be crossed. Nell was fine, bruised, hoarse for a week and fine. I saw a photograph of her, months afterwards at some garden thing, laughing with her head back, and I put the paper down and had to go and stand in the yard for a while. The paper crown, in case you're wondering, was picked up by a police officer and put in an evidence bag with a number on it. I watched him do it. It was sodden by then. The glitter had all come off in the puddle, and it lay there on the gravel afterwards, a little smear of gold on the wet stone, and it was still there when they walked me out. I delivered the clock 2 weeks later. Different gate. A man signed for it and thanked me and asked if I'd been there, and I said yes, and he looked at me for a moment, and then he shook my hand and didn't say anything else, which was the kindest thing anybody did for me that whole autumn. It's in a room in that house now, doing what it was built in 1861 to do. 4 seconds. I've spent 41 years learning to hear them. I can hear a clock losing 2 seconds a day from across a workshop. I once told a man his carriage clock was out of beat over the telephone. And I stood on a wet pavement with all that in my head, and I counted 4 seconds while a child was lifted onto her toes by the throat. And I did nothing, because 4 seconds is nothing. 4 seconds is a breath. 4 seconds is not enough time for a man of 61 with a bad knee to do anything at all. But it was enough for him. That's what I can't get past. That's the whole of it, really. Everybody wants the story to be about the man in the gray coat, and what was wrong with him, and whose fault it was, and whether the gate should have been shut. And those are all decent questions, and I've no answers to any of them. I went back once, the following spring. I stood at the east gate on a bright cold morning with my hands in my pockets, and there was a different guard on the box. And then a few weeks after that there was Ashby, and I recognized him instantly. And I stood at those railings for 20 minutes looking at a man who had no idea who I was. I didn't say anything. What would I have said? But just before I left, I put my hand on the railing, and I said quietly, more to myself than to him, 9 feet. And I'd swear on anything you like, his eyes came across. Half a second, less, then straight back to nothing. Maybe I imagined it. I'm an old man who hears clocks in empty rooms. People ask me what the Royal Guard is for these days. They say it like it's a joke that's gone on too long. All that cloth and all that ceremony, standing still for the tourists, letting people shout in their faces. I never argue. I've stopped arguing. I just tell them there was a morning in September when everything on that pavement was exactly what it looked like. The crowd was a crowd, the palace was a postcard, and the guard was a statue in a silly hat. And then for 4 seconds it wasn't.